Okay, so this will be my first web post. It's audio format, me basically talking. Basically my goal here is just to get people to think a little bit outside the box and to not get so angry about things. One of the main things I dislike about talk radio is the name calling and the unprofessionalism and the disrespect that occurs by everyone. There's very few people on talk radio that I listen to who I respect, and they're not very informative. They usually talk about something and they'll talk about Obama and they'll hate on him, or they'll talk about someone else and that's all they'll talk about is just the politics of everything. And it's interesting and it's important, but it's not what's really important, and that's talking about real issues. And there are many, for example, there are many Ron Paul supporters who support Ron Paul fully, but and they can talk about it, quite a big deal about Ron Paul, but they don't talk about the issues. And that's something that really needs to be talked about. And even in this whole election process, there's no issues. It's just the politics of it all. So hopefully with this, I would discuss and we'd think about issues that are important and just to think about it outside the box. I am both a libertarian and a socialist. I lean more towards libertarianism because it just makes more sense. And I like the idea of liberty and freedom, and I like the idea of evolving and changing to a better society instead of becoming what we've already been. And I think that's really important. So today, these are going to be short little segments, maybe 15 minutes, and it's just me, again, going over a few issues. And one of the issues for today is this one, which is the government, Rick Scott's order to drug test state workers was ruled unconstitutional. Now, we were discussing this in a topics forum, and we went back and forth. They were basically deciding whether a state mandating drug test is constitutional or unconstitutional. Now, before anyone can have any discussion regarding this topic, like any at all, and it's funny because in the discussion that nobody mentioned this at all, but the Fourth Amendment, that's what the judge kind of looks at least on the basis of, it says here they looked at the Fourth Amendment unreasonable search aspect, but they went and discussed privacy rights, which if you look at the print of the Fourth Amendment, it says nothing about privacy specifically. It just says that people have a right to be secure in their people, anything they own basically, against unreasonable searches and seizures. So if there's going to be a search and a seizure, like if there's going to be both or, then it should be reasonable. So the discussion really should be whether drug testing and a state drug testing is reasonable. But it's interesting because nobody's really discussing, especially in the forum, whether it's actually reasonable. Instead, they discuss what they think should happen, that it makes sense because you want to curb crime and you want to make sure you have the right people in there and they're not causing mischief or whatever the argument is. But regardless, it's whether it's reasonable. And again, one person, and I don't understand this argument, and I really wish I'd like to understand it fully, but he argues that the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to the government in this aspect because the government is an employer. So, of course, the Fourth Amendment and the Bill of Rights applies just to the government, unless stated otherwise, but it all applies to the government, not to private industry or corporations. Yet, this individual is arguing that because the role of the government is an employer, that they should be allowed to have a drug test because it makes sense. Private industry, they have that, so why can't the government? And again, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with that argument, but it's not, if you were to argue as far as the bottom line of it, the outcome, but when you when you state that the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to the government because it's not because it is an employer, it just doesn't make any sense. Because then you could say, well, it shouldn't apply because, or it should apply, and they should require drug testing at schools, maybe because the government is a educator. So their role is an educator, and so they should have the ability, whether it's reasonable or not, to just search and take someone's pee and determine if they're on drugs or not, or if they've taken it. Now, of course, many people would agree that that should be what should happen. They should do that. They do it, and it's actually constitutional that a school can have a drug test if a student wants to join a sports team or something after school, or an extracurricular activity. But at the same time, it is vital to look at the Fourth Amendment and what it says. And so if you're going to have a discussion about whether drug testing should be allowed or not, it's, again, the Fourth Amendment applies to the government. Whether it's an employer, an educator, whatever, it's the government. So then the discussion is whether it's reasonable or unreasonable. Now, I would personally argue that searching people for if they've taken drugs and to make them pee in a cup and then to seize that, to me, that's unreasonable. I just don't see any proper reasoning that because you do drugs maybe once in a while, or you could possibly do drugs at one time, that you're not a good worker. I think that's just it's a silly argument, and not to mention the cost of it. And in this article, it mentions too that they actually they suspended the policy, but they continued to actually drug test people in one of the departments, the Juvenile Justice Department. And in those drug tests, only 2% in 4 years did drugs. They were positive. They tested positive on the test. 2%. And I just don't see why you would want to disregard the Fourth Amendment and what it stands for 2% of the people, or just to get 2% of the people out of the way, so that more people can fill in that void, and then eventually you're always going to have 2% probably on drugs or did drugs at one point. And again, the discussion really should be, again, if it's reasonable, but also, let's say someone did do drugs, does it make them a bad worker? Now, they're not following the law, so you could argue that that's bad, but I would do my argument that I always make with that, which is, does everyone follow the law? How many laws are broken? How many people break a law every day? I see it all the time when I'm driving on the road and I'm in a 35 zone and someone's going 45, or when I'm on the highway and it's 65 and someone's going 85. All the time. It's not just here and there, it's all the time. Not to mention all the codes or the permits that aren't properly provided to people, or they don't go through the process. And yet they're okay workers. We don't have a test for them. But wouldn't it be reasonable to see if someone's following the law? I think that's kind of the bigger picture there. It's not necessarily the drugs, it's that they're breaking the law, right? But again, I still think that that whole debate is kind of just, it's just too unreasonable for me to sideline the Fourth Amendment and the protections that it has, especially to treat the government as an employer, and thus the Fourth Amendment wouldn't apply. So it should be whether it's reasonable or unreasonable. And bottom line is, I think it is unreasonable, according to the Fourth Amendment. Now, another great story is this one, and we'll play it.
I'm Carissa Lathan. Imagine going to a restaurant, receiving terrible service, and then being forced to pay a 17% tip. That's exactly what happened to a group of friends visiting Loch Fisherman in Houston, Texas.
And the family says, could we speak to a manager, because we might want to give our own personal opinion about the gratuity that we want to leave. Well, it turns out that they didn't have any options. The restaurant called the police. and basically held them hostage inside the restaurant and said, you can't leave until you pay the gratuity.
Yahoo's Odd News highlighted a local Texas station who interviewed the angry customer. Jasmine Marks says she attempted to speak with authorities, but to no avail.
They say they were locked inside and the police were called.
I asked the police officer twice, maybe 3 times, is it against the law if we don't pay the gratuity? And he never gave me a straight answer.
This also isn't the first gratuity debacle to make headlines. Philly.com reports 2 college students were arrested after refusing to pay an 18% gratuity at a pub in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania.
Now, I think this is an important discussion because it's the role of the police here and what responsibilities they have with an individual and a private business. And here, the customer who went in didn't like the service and didn't want to pay the gratuity that's stated probably on the menu that says there's a mandatory gratuity that they have to pay. But they didn't want to pay it because it was bad service. And to me, it's a great debate that you could have on whether the police should even be involved and whether that should be illegal if it is or if it isn't, and how that process works. I mean, I've heard other stories previously where someone will call the police because they didn't get a chicken nugget. I remember that story was really big about a year ago or so, and that happens quite often. And to me, it's kind of the same situation here. Is why are the cops involved at all in that process? To me, it's a contract dispute between you and that business owner. And if they didn't serve, then you shouldn't have to pay. And if they want to sue you so that to make you pay, then that's what they should do. And if you want to sue them for not getting a nugget, then that's what you should do. But of course, that's probably not going to happen because of the cost. It's cost prohibitive, and it really just doesn't make any sense. It's all silly. But so is forcing people to pay gratuity. So, but again, you came in and you read it, and you should understand that you should have to pay the gratuity, whether the service is good or not. And to me, that's a good discussion of whether gratuity should exist or whether it should be forced upon someone. We tend to talk a lot about big government forcing people to do things. But it seems like in something like this, that seems silly. It does. But there's a lot of silly things that the government does that people complain about all the time. And we should also be able to discuss when corporations or businesses do silly things. And they shouldn't force anyone to pay gratuity, because basically all that does is just add to the cost of the product. But again, you don't have to take it. But if I was her, I would have just walked out. And I don't see how that should be illegal. You definitely should not be able to get arrested for that. You didn't. There's no theft involved. I don't understand how that would be theft. You owe something. But bottom line is, you would go to law, you'd go to court and figure it out. And of course, that probably wouldn't happen. But that's basically our show today. And I think it did okay. It was about 15 minutes long, and that's probably what I was shooting for. Again, the purpose of this is just to think a little critically. Again, with the Fourth Amendment issue, I think it's important to make sure we look at the Fourth Amendment and look at the Constitution whenever we're debating anything, and to make sure you're actually reading it instead of just thinking what you want. Because that's what judges often do, is and it happened in this case too, where they know how they want to rule, and they're against something, and then they kind of look at the law and they figure it out. Because even in this opinion, the judge ruled that there was a privacy interest that was involved, and that should be protected. Now, whether there's an actual privacy interest and protection found in the Constitution is a whole other debate, but it's definitely not within the Fourth Amendment, because all it's stating is that it has to be a reasonable search and seizure. So you could say there's a privacy issue, but again, the bottom line is the reasonableness of it. And like I said before, I just don't think it's reasonable to conduct a random drug test of 85,000 state employees. It's just, there's no purpose. There's truly no purpose, especially when only 2% are caught and actually have done drugs before. It just doesn't make any sense. And again, whether someone actually does drugs, whether that means they're a bad employee, I think they could spend their time more better if they focused on what makes a good employee and what makes a bad employee and get rid of those bad employees. So if they're going to spend money on drug tests, they should either not spend it, or they should spend it on some sort of way to get rid of those people who should not be in there. And I'm sure you would get rid of some of those drug people, but maybe not. Because again, I'm not saying that a person who does drugs is not a good worker. I think that's just silly. But again, that's the show for today. I'll see you next week.